Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Kiana Canada. Welcome back to Kiana's Show. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are talking about the possibility of the United States going to war with Iran. Are we on the brink of war? Some may say we are, some may say they don't know. But recent reports have shown that the United States has positioned several U.S. naval assets in the Middle East. Some of those are the USS Gerald Ford, USS Abraham Lincoln, USS Roosevelt, among others. And we have seen that USA has engaged in some negotiation talks, but there are conflicting reports as to whether the United States is going to move forward with an attack on Iran. Furthermore, the conflicting reports have stated that these talks were successful. Other reports say that the attacks weren't successful. And so it is, I think, for the American people and citizens in other countries, it is quite confusing as to whether or not this attack is going to proceed. Now, I did a bit of research and, watched a news report and there was this political strategist on there named Renee Wild-Angle who said that 27% of Americans support the attack on Iran. But think about it, that's only 27%. Only 27%. That means 73% does not support the attack on Iran. That's more than half of the country that does not want this war to happen. And so while I looked at a Venn diagram, I think it's called, or maybe just a diagram in general of U.S. warships in the Middle East surrounding Iran, I couldn't help but to think about how the U.S. surrounded Venezuela. And we know the strategy that the United States used with Venezuela. So what it did was it very slowly surrounded Venezuela, and then it used technology. The lights went out in that nation, and then the United States made way on land, attacked, captured Maduro, and then brought Maduro to the U.S. and to face justice, essentially. And it raises, I think, an important question for us as to whether the United States is going to be using the same stratagem with Iran. Now, there are some similarities, right? So with Venezuela, the U.S. surrounded that nation, and we see that happening with Iran. We see that the U.S. is slowly creeping up to Iran and surrounding the nation, and that is indicative that the U.S. is preparing to attack Iran. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm calling this the Jolly Sailor Boat stratagem. Now, I get this from the Pirates of the Caribbean, where there was this boat of sailors in the middle of the sea, And you had these mermaids coming up, slowly creeping up, and you had this one mermaid to engage in a persuasive, seductive tactic to lure one of the mermans, to gain that merman's, to lure one of the sailors, to gain that sailor's attention, to tantalize and to hold that sailor's attention. And essentially that could be, in this particular situation, of course, the Pirates of the Caribbean is a fictional movie, it's not real, but as it relates to military strategy, the mermaid here could be the US official that is going to engage in negotiations. But the question remains is, does the US want peace with these sailors? So again, the US here is the mermaid. Does it really want peace with these men on this boat, which is of course Iran? And that is what we haven't figured out, right? And I mean everybody who is watching this. And in that movie, in the Pirates of the Caribbean, the mermaid who went up to the boat and seduced the sailor was able to seduce the sailor. All of the other sailors were like, no, 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 no. So I think it raises an important question as to whether or not this is what happened recently. Because remember, there are some reports that have come out to say that these diplomatic talks did not go successful. And that diplomatic talk could be that persuasion and, engaging in that, interplay of peace talks in order to gain an advantage. Now, we must remember that, of course, in the Pirates of the Caribbean, where this one mermaid got close to the boat, essentially what she was doing was she was distracting every person on that boat. And not necessarily, they were distracted in a way that all of their attention was focused on her. But while she was seducing this one sailor, other mermaids came up out of the ocean or out of the sea and surrounded the boat. And before these sailors knew, they were all surrounded. And these mermaids were very beautiful and they looked very peaceful. But then we all know what happens, right? That those mermaids engaged in an attack. They engaged in an attack, and that was their goal, was to attack. And that's why I'm calling this Jolly Sailor Boat Stratagem. Because I think when we look at this, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at it and we dissect it and we analyze it, the reason the US is moving those military ships, those warships, and positioning them around Iran is because it's likely going to attack Iran. Now, I'm not a military agent or officer. I don't have intelligence, so I don't know if that's going to happen or not. But it sure does look like it from a layman's point of view. And again, I think when we dissect it even further, there has been the idea that you're not supposed to use the same strategy twice. But again, I don't know if that applies to military stratagem. That could just be a saying in life. It may work, but it does appear as if the US plans to use this this jolly sailor boat strategy again. I mean, to be sure, with Venezuela, to reiterate, it surrounded that nation and then used a tactic where it, I think it hacked into the systems there in Venezuela, made everything dark, and then was able to proceed on land. And that could very well be what the U.S. plans to do in Iran. It could plan to distract it like the mermaid did to the sailor. And then there is some kind of strategy where the U.S. is able to advance on land and then attack. And it raises an important question as to whether or not the strategy, or excuse me, whether or not the attack on Venezuela was practice, whether this was a practice to see if this was going to be efficacious. And when it learned that it was efficacious, then it could use that again, right? Now, keep in mind, the United States, one of the way in which the United States has always worked is to test it out first, to see if it works. And if it works, then use it again, but use it stronger. Use it again and again and again and again. And covert strategies have often been what the U.S. is good at. Again, none of us really seen the attack coming with Venezuela, but with this, everybody knows that an attack is likely imminent. So it raises an important question as to whether this is going to be efficacious. There was a report that came out that the U.S. military shot down a U.S. drone, and some politicians in the U.S. are calling this reckless. There is a bit of confusion as to why this happened, why they did this, what was the purpose of it. But the United States has done this before when it is preparing to engage in military operations. This isn't a new phenomenon. In 1997, the U.S. Army mounted an exercise, and the code name was Force 21, to test the application of digital technologies in warfare. The goal of Force 21 was to improve logistics through the application of computer technology adapted for military use. So it could very well be that the U.S. is attempting to test, right? It is attempting to test out this computer technology, to test it out to see if it's going to work in Iran. That is possible. It's possible because the purpose of testing it out is to see if it's going to work in warfare. Why else would any person test that out, or any government or any military test it out, other than to see if it's going to be successful in warfare? And that could be the reason, to reiterate, why the U.S. did shoot down that drone. And so it raises an important question, I think, right, as to whether or not the U.S. anticipates there to be dronage where they're going to, near Iran, right, near the waters of Iran, or on Iranian territory, anticipating that that might be something that could trip it up. To be sure, the supreme leader of Iran made a threat that warships could be sunken to the bottom of the ocean. And the only way I think that that could happen is with drones or other military weapons. And so the US may engage in these exercises to see if it's going to be successful in capturing drones in the region. To reiterate, the specific aims are to increase awareness of one's own position in the battlefield. So the battlefield is definitely going to be on these warships and could possibly be any soldiers or military men that's going to come off of those warships onto the territory, and to have a clear sense of the enemy's position. We can only pray that these two nations somehow work it out and come to an agreement and reach an agreement that brings everybody peace, which is, I think, the important aspect of this that we should not lose sight of. And I hope that these peace talks, if there's going to be another round of peace talks, that they are successful, so that Americans and Iranians are not thrusted into Americans, because Iranians were at war as well, so Americans and Iranians were not thrusted into another war. I think that that's going to be important. So hopefully there is a successful talk. But again, I think I'm calling this probably Operation Jolly Sailor Boat. Operation Jolly Sailor Boat. And wondering if that's going to be a successful strategy. Because remember, in Pirates of the Caribbean, most of the, I think I've already said this, but most of those men on that boat lost their lives, but some mermaids lost their lives too, right? So the question is who is at a stronger advantage here? I mean, Iran is on solid ground, and the United States is within the water. And so, in order for, I think, this attack to be successful for the US, is if somehow the United States was able to lure Iranians into the water, because that's what the mermaids did. But other than that, we know that mermaids really lose that power on land. And so it remains to be seen. Again, mermaids are not real. The Pirates of the Caribbean is just a fictional movie, but I was watching a snippet of Jolly Sailor Boat, that scene, earlier this evening, and I said that reminds me a lot of how the US is surrounding Iran and how it surrounded Venezuela, and it reminded me of that. So what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Do you think that this Operation Jolly Sailor Boat is going to be efficacious? Do you think that the peace talks are going to win the day? Do you think that eventually or imminently that the US and Iran are going to be thrusted into another war? All of these things I want to know. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk to you next time. Bye-bye.